the interruption that shattered the dream. The Westwood estate had never looked more magnificent. Golden chandeliers bathed the grand hall in a warm glow, casting flickering light across the exquisite floral arrangements that adorned every corner. Rows of pristine white roses lined the aisle, their delicate fragrance mingling with the soft melody of the live string quartet playing in the background. It was a wedding fit for royalty. At the altar stood Thomas Westwood, a man in his early 40s, his broad shoulders squared beneath a tailored navy blue suit. His face, usually composed and confident, was now softened with emotion. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment he would finally rebuild the family he had lost years ago. His bride, Clara Hastings, stood opposite him, radiant in an ivory gown that hugged her slender frame. Her cascading curls framed her flawless features, and her honey-colored eyes shimmered with what seemed to be love and devotion. She looked like a dream. As the officiant cleared his throat to continue the ceremony, Thomas reached for Clara's hand, his fingers tingling with anticipation. The guests, seated in the pews, watched with bated breath. Friends, family, business associates, everyone was present to witness what was being dubbed the wedding of the year. And then, just as Thomas lifted the wedding band, a piercing voice shattered the moment. "Dad! You can't marry her!" A collective gasp rippled through the room. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing, the notes hanging in the air like ghosts. Conversations hushed. Heads turned toward the source of the voice. Standing in the middle of the aisle was Kathy Westwood, Thomas's 12-year-old daughter. She was trembling. She wasn't dressed like a girl seeking attention or throwing a tantrum. She wasn't pouting or crying out of jealousy. Instead, she stood firm, fists clenched at her sides, her chest rising and falling as if she had just sprinted into the room. Her small, fragile frame looked even smaller under the weight of the moment, but her voice, though breaking with fear, was loud enough to stop everything. Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief. "Kathy?" His voice carried both concern and confusion. Clara's radiant smile faltered for the briefest second before she quickly masked it with a look of innocence. She turned toward the young girl with a carefully composed expression. "Sweetheart," she cooed, her voice filled with feigned warmth, "what's wrong? Did something upset you?" Kathy took a sharp breath. "She's lying to you, Dad. She's not who she says she is." The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Whispers of confusion and speculation spread like wildfire. Thomas turned back to his daughter, his mind racing. Kathy had always been an observant child, sharp, intelligent, and never one to act out irrationally. If she was standing here, making such a bold claim, she must have had a reason. Clara let out a soft, nervous chuckle. "Oh, Thomas, she's just overwhelmed. It's a big day for all of us." She reached for his arm, squeezing it gently. Children can sometimes struggle with change. Kathy shook her head violently. "No. This isn't about me not wanting you to get married. She's not who she says she is." More gasps. The officiant awkwardly cleared his throat, unsure of whether to intervene or let the drama unfold. Thomas's brows furrowed. "Kathy, I need you to tell me exactly what's going on." Kathy hesitated. Her fingers dug into the soft pink fabric of her dress. She had uncovered something that had made her stomach twist with unease. She had spent all night debating whether to speak up. Whether she should ruin the happiest day of her father's life. But she couldn't stay silent. She lifted her chin, her voice shaking but determined. "I saw something. Something that proves she's lying." A heavy silence settled over the room. Clara's grip on Thomas's arm tightened ever so slightly. The tension was unbearable. Thomas felt his chest constrict. "What did you see, Kathy?" Kathy swallowed hard, her small hand slipping into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she tapped the screen. The guests leaned in. Even the wedding photographer, who had been capturing every precious moment of the ceremony, lowered his camera. And then, as Kathy's finger hovered over the screen, ready to reveal the truth, Clara took a step backward. It was subtle, barely noticeable to most. But Thomas saw it. And Kathy saw it. That single movement was not the action of an innocent woman. It was the movement of someone who had just realized they were about to be exposed. Thomas felt a strange chill creep up his spine. "Clara," he said slowly, his voice dangerously calm. "Why do you look nervous?" Clara let out a forced laugh, waving a delicate hand in the air. "Oh, Thomas, don't be silly. I'm not nervous at all." But her eyes told a different story. Kathy's grip on the phone tightened. "She's lying, Dad." And then, in a move that sent a fresh wave of whispers through the crowd, Clara turned around and bolted toward the exit. The chase for the truth. The moment Clara spun on her heels and bolted for the exit, the grand wedding hall erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the guests. Some rose from their seats, craning their necks to see what was happening, while others exchanged confused whispers. The officiant, who had been standing frozen with his ceremonial book in hand, blinked in disbelief. Thomas, still gripping the wedding band between his fingers, stood motionless. His mind struggled to process what he had just seen. Clara, the woman he was about to marry, the woman who had sworn she loved him, had run the moment his daughter claimed she was lying. Why? What was she hiding? Before he could react, Kathy took off. Her small feet pounded against the glossy marble floor as she sprinted after Clara, her heart hammering against her ribcage. She didn't know what she expected, but she knew one thing for sure: her father needed to see the truth before it was too late. "Kathy!" Thomas finally snapped out of his daze and rushed after his daughter, his long strides quickly closing the gap. The guests remained in stunned silence as the dramatic scene unfolded. Some whispered in speculation, others pulled out their phones, eager to record the unexpected twist. Clara, in her pristine white wedding gown, darted through the wide double doors leading out of the hall, her veil whipping behind her. Her perfectly styled curls bounced wildly as she pushed past a group of waiters carrying trays of champagne, nearly knocking one over. "Clara! Stop!" Thomas's voice boomed through the corridor. But she didn't stop. Kathy pushed harder, her lungs burning as she forced herself to keep up. She had to catch her. They turned a corner. Clara's heels skidded against the polished floors as she grabbed onto a pillar for support. Her breath came in short gasps. For the first time, Kathy saw fear in the woman's eyes. Not the fear of a misunderstanding, but the fear of being exposed. "She knows I found something." That realization gave Kathy the final push she needed. With a burst of determination, she lunged forward and grabbed onto Clara's wrist. "Let me go!" Clara shrieked, twisting violently to free herself. "Not until you tell the truth," Kathy shouted back. Before Clara could rip her arm away, Thomas finally caught up to them. His presence loomed over them, his breath heavy from running. His sharp eyes flicked between his daughter's furious expression and Clara's panicked one. Something inside him cracked. "Clara!" His voice was dangerously low now. "Why are you running?" Clara's lips parted, but no words came out. Her entire body tensed. Then, without warning, she swung her arm and slapped Kathy's hand away. Kathy stumbled back, clutching her stinging fingers. The sound echoed through the corridor. Thomas's entire body went rigid. His daughter, his sweet, strong little girl, had just been hit by the woman he was about to marry. Clara must have realized what she had done because her expression immediately softened. "Oh my God, I didn't mean." "Don't." Thomas's voice was steel now. "Don't you dare." The look in his eyes made Clara take a step back. Kathy blinked through the burning sensation in her hand and lifted her phone. "Look at this, Dad." Her voice was steadier now. Clara's gaze darted to the device, her breath hitching. Thomas hesitated. He could hear the wedding guests stirring in the distance, still murmuring over the shocking interruption. But right now, this moment, was all that mattered. He took the phone from his daughter's outstretched hand. The screen was open to a bank statement. Thomas frowned. It was a bank transfer, $50,000, deposited into an unknown account just yesterday. At first, it didn't make sense. But then Kathy swiped to the next image. A conversation. It was a screenshot of text messages between Clara and an unknown number. "Unknown number, the money is in your account. Once the wedding is over, make sure you do what you promised. Clara, relax. He won't suspect a thing. By the time I'm done, he won't even know what hit him." Thomas's heart stopped. A sharp, cold sensation spread through his chest. His grip on the phone tightened as he stared at the words, willing them to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything but the truth. But there it was. The woman he loved. The woman he had trusted. The woman he had planned to spend the rest of his life with. Was scamming him. Kathy's voice was barely above a whisper. "She's after your money, Dad." Clara bolted again. But this time, Thomas caught her. His strong hand latched onto her wrist, yanking her back with force. Clara let out a startled gasp as she stumbled. "You're not going anywhere." His voice was cold. Clara's chest heaved as she finally dropped the act. The fake sweetness in her eyes vanished. The delicate innocence in her face disappeared. And in its place, was nothing but anger. "Damn it, Thomas," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You were never supposed to find out." Kathy let out a sharp breath. "So you admit it." Clara yanked at her wrist, but Thomas refused to let go. "Who were you working with?" His voice was dangerously low now. "Who paid you?" Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Like I'd tell you." The weight of her betrayal crushed him. The months of planning. The late-night conversations. The moments he had thought were genuine. All of it was a lie. Kathy stared at her father, waiting for him to break down. To doubt her. To convince himself that it wasn't true. But to her surprise, he didn't. His fingers clenched into fists. His jaw tightened. And then, he reached for his phone. Kathy blinked. "Dad?" He was calling 911. Clara's eyes widened. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Thomas's gaze was ice. "I'm making sure you don't scam another man ever again." Clara thrashed. "You have no proof." Kathy lifted her phone higher. "We do." Clara's entire body shook. She turned toward Thomas, her expression shifting from rage to desperation. "Baby, please. I was confused. It's not what you think." Thomas didn't even look at her. The line clicked. 911, what's your emergency?" He lifted the phone to his ear. "I need officers at the Westwood estate. Now." Clara's face drained of color. The sound of approaching sirens echoed in the distance. The wedding of the year had just become the scandal of the century. The truth unraveled. The sound of sirens grew louder. Clara's breathing turned shallow as panic twisted her face. She yanked against Thomas's grip, but he was unmovable. Guests had started pouring out of the wedding hall now, murmuring in confusion and recording the scene with their phones. The grand Westwood estate, which had been decorated for the most elegant wedding of the season, was now the stage for a scandal that would never be forgotten. Kathy stood firm beside her father, her phone still clutched in her hands. The evidence was there. The screenshots of the texts, the bank transfers, it was all real. Clara knew it. And that's when her panic turned to rage. She twisted sharply, wrenching herself free from Thomas's grip. Instead of running, she turned to Kathy. "You little brat," she seethed, stepping forward. Thomas immediately moved to shield his daughter. His entire body tensed, his presence towering over Clara. His jaw clenched, and his voice came out cold and sharp. "Don't take another step." Clara froze. For the first time since this ordeal began, she seemed to understand, there was no way out. The distant wail of sirens had turned into flashing red and blue lights. 2 squad cars screeched to a stop outside the estate's main entrance, and 3 uniformed officers spilled out. Their radios crackled as they assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" one of them called out, stepping closer. Thomas turned, his expression unreadable. "She's involved in a financial scam. I have proof." He nodded toward Kathy, who immediately handed the phone to one of the officers. Clara's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape. Guests continued to whisper among themselves. Some gasped and they realized the police were actually here for the bride. The officers scanned the messages and bank statements. Their faces darkened. "This is serious," one officer murmured. He lifted his gaze to Clara. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us for questioning." Clara snapped. "No," she screamed, taking a step back. "You can't arrest me. This is my wedding." One of the officers moved swiftly, reaching for her wrist. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Clara lunged. She shoved past the officers, her silk gown billowing behind her as she sprinted toward the exit like a wild animal caught in a trap. Guests gasped as waiters stumbled out of the way, their trays crashing to the floor. But before she could reach the door, she collided headfirst into another figure. Bam! She staggered back, disoriented. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, grabbed her firmly before she could regain her footing. His grip was unrelenting, his expression filled with pure disgust. Clara's blood ran cold. "You," she whispered. It was Raymond Carter. The man who had just arrived, the one standing over her with a clenched jaw and furious eyes, was the same name she had seen in her text messages. He was the one who had wired her the money. And now, he was here. Thomas's face twisted in confusion. "Who the hell are you?" Raymond ignored him. His focus was on Clara, his voice a deadly whisper. "You weren't supposed to screw this up." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kathy's breath hitched. There was more to this. The officers stepped forward immediately. "Sir, do you know this woman?" Raymond straightened. "Yeah." His voice was bitter. "I know her all too well." Thomas's fists tightened. "What the hell is going on?" Raymond let out a harsh chuckle. "You think she was acting alone?" He turned his cold gaze to Clara, who was still frozen in place. "Tell him, sweetheart. Tell him the real plan." Clara's lips trembled. Tell him." Raymond's voice boomed through the grand estate, sending a chill down everyone's spine. The officers immediately pulled him back. "Calm down, sir." Thomas turned to Clara, his voice a raw whisper. "Tell me the truth. Now." Clara's entire body sagged. Her perfectly curated life, the lavish wedding, the lies she had spun so effortlessly, the future she had built on deception, was over. A single tear slipped down her cheek. And then, she spoke. "I was never going to marry you." Silence. The words were like a knife to Thomas's chest. Clara swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Raymond and I had a deal. I'd marry you. Play the perfect wife. And once I had access to your finances, we'd drain your accounts and disappear. Thomas felt like he had been punched. Every smile, every kiss, every whispered promise, it had all been fake. Kathy's throat tightened, but she stood firm beside her father. He needed to hear this. Clara took a shuddering breath. I didn't expect your daughter to snoop. She ruined everything. Her eyes flicked toward Kathy, filled with bitter resentment. If she hadn't. Thomas stepped forward, his expression dark. If she hadn't, I would have married a woman who never loved me. Clara's silence was enough of an answer. A new, deeper kind of pain settled into Thomas's chest. The officers wasted no more time. Clara Jones, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud. They swiftly cuffed her hands behind her back. Raymond, realizing his fate was sealed, didn't even resist when they turned to him next. And you're coming with us, too. As the two were led away, Clara twisted her head to look back at Thomas one last time. Her face was unreadable. Was it regret? Shame? Or just bitterness that she had lost? Thomas didn't care anymore. He didn't say another word. He simply watched as the woman he had once loved was dragged away, leaving behind nothing but a ruined wedding and a shattered illusion. Aftermath. As the police cars disappeared down the long driveway, Thomas let out a shaky breath. The guests had started murmuring again, already spinning the gossip of the century. But at that moment, none of that mattered. Kathy stepped closer. Her voice was soft. Dad? He turned, looking down at his daughter, the one person who had saved him from a life-altering mistake. His eyes softened. And for the first time that day, a small, relieved smile tugged at his lips. Thank you. Kathy exhaled, finally feeling the weight lift off her shoulders. She had protected her father. And that was all that mattered. As father and daughter walked away from the wreckage of the wedding, Thomas spoke one last time. What do you say we go get some ice cream? Kathy blinked, then laughed. You read my mind. And just like that, they walked toward the future. Together. After the storm. 1 week later. The grand wedding that never happened had become the biggest scandal in the city. Every major news outlet had picked up the story, millionaire groom betrayed at the altar. Bride exposed as a gold digger. Shocking wedding day arrest, fraud and betrayal unveiled. The Westwood estate, once meant to host a day of joy, had instead seen its lavish decorations torn down in disgrace. Guests still gossiped about how Clara and Raymond had been dragged away in handcuffs in front of everyone. And Thomas? He had vanished from the public eye. Not because he was ashamed, but because he needed time. The healing process. Kathy found her father sitting in his study one evening, staring at an old photo album. He had barely spoken about Clara since that day. She hesitated at the doorway. Dad? Thomas looked up. His face was tired but softer than before. Hey, sweetheart. Kathy stepped inside and sat next to him. She peered at the open page, pictures of him and Clara from when they first started dating. She looked radiant, smiling up at him with a look of love. Or at least, what had seemed like love. Kathy frowned. You don't still have feelings for her, do you? Thomas let out a slow breath, his gaze lingering on the photo. I don't know if I ever really knew her. That answer was enough. He wasn't mourning Clara. He was mourning the illusion of her. It's okay to feel hurt, Kathy said softly. But she never deserved you. Thomas turned to his daughter, studying her for a moment before smiling. You saved me. Kathy grinned. I know. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt lighter. Meanwhile, in jail. Clara sat in her cell, her perfectly manicured nails chipped, her once elegant wedding gown replaced by an orange jumpsuit. The reality had sunk in. Her once glamorous world had crumbled. Her socialite friends? Gone. Her future with Thomas? Destroyed. Her access to his wealth? Never happening. And worst of all, Raymond had turned on her. The moment they were separated for questioning, he cut a deal. He painted Clara as the mastermind behind the scam, claiming she had manipulated him into helping her. And since Clara had no real proof to defend herself, she was left alone to take the fall. She clenched her fists as she stared at the gray prison wall. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be on a honeymoon in the Maldives. She was supposed to be rich and untouchable. But Kathy had ruined everything. Her teeth ground together as she whispered under her breath. That little brat. She wasn't done yet. Raymond's fate. Unlike Clara, Raymond's situation was far from ideal. Yes, he had made a deal. But that didn't mean he was walking free. The authorities had dug deeper into his past and found several previous scams linked to him. This wasn't his first time trying to con a rich businessman out of his fortune. With his record, even the plea deal couldn't save him. His sentence? 10 years in prison. And unlike Clara, he knew when he was beat. He sat in his own cell, staring at the ceiling, and muttered to himself with a bitter laugh. Should have just walked away. The lawsuit. Clara had one last surprise waiting for her. 3 weeks after her arrest, she received a legal notice. Thomas was suing her. For fraud. For emotional damages. For every single dollar she had ever taken from him. Her head spun as she read through the document. She was already facing prison time, now, she'd leave with nothing. Thomas wasn't just walking away from her. He was making sure she could never do this again. 6 months later. Life had moved on. Kathy returned to her studies, excelling in her courses. She and her father grew even closer, the ordeal bringing them together like never before. And Thomas? He finally felt free. For months, he had blamed himself. How could he not have seen the truth? How had he fallen for a woman who only wanted his money? But eventually, he realized something. Love hadn't made him blind. Hope had. He had hoped for a future with Clara. Hoped for happiness. But he had been looking in the wrong place. One evening, as Kathy walked into the kitchen, she noticed something new. Her father was smiling. Genuinely smiling. And beside him? A woman she didn't recognize. Kathy's brow lifted. Dad? Thomas turned, chuckling at her expression. Sweetheart, meet Anna. We met at the charity event last month. Kathy studied the woman. She seemed kind, genuine, nothing like Clara. A slow grin stretched across her face. Nice to meet you, Anna. And as the three of them sat down for dinner, laughter filling the air, Kathy realized something. For the first time in years, her father was truly happy. And that was all she ever wanted, shadows of the past. 6 months had passed since the disastrous wedding, and life for Thomas and Kathy had finally settled into something peaceful, even joyful. But while they had moved forward, someone else had not. Clara. Trapped behind prison bars, her once perfect life was nothing but a memory. The designer clothes, the high-end jewelry, the luxurious vacations, all gone. Instead, she had rough prison uniforms, cold steel bunks, and the sound of screaming inmates echoing through the halls at night. But there was one thing Clara still had. Hatred. And she would make sure the people who ruined her life paid. A disturbing letter. One evening, Kathy sat at the kitchen counter, finishing up some schoolwork. Her father had gone out for dinner with Anna, the new woman in his life, and Kathy was glad to see him happy again. Ding dong. The front doorbell rang. Kathy frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. Who would be visiting at this hour? She set her notebook aside and walked to the door. When she opened it, she found no one there. Just an envelope, lying on the doorstep. Her heart lurched. It was addressed to her. Slowly, she bent down, picked it up, and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. She moved to the kitchen, staring at the envelope in her hands. The handwriting was strangely familiar. With shaky fingers, she tore it open and unfolded the letter inside. And when she read the first line, her breath hitched. "Hello, Kathy. I haven't forgotten you." It was signed. Clara. Clara's warning. Kathy's hands trembled as she continued reading. "I hope you've been enjoying your little victory, thinking you destroyed me. Thinking you got your way. But don't fool yourself, Kathy. I may be behind bars, but I am not gone. And I am not alone. You cost me everything. My future. My freedom. My life. But people like me? We always find a way. And trust me, sweetheart. I will have my revenge. Enjoy your peaceful little life while you still can. See you soon." Kathy's pulse pounded in her ears. How had Clara managed to send this? Was someone helping her from the outside? And, what did she mean by, "see you soon"? A deep feeling of dread settled in Kathy's stomach. She needed to tell her dad. Immediately. Thomas reacts. When Thomas returned home an hour later, Kathy ran straight to him. "Dad, you need to see this," she gasped, thrusting the letter into his hands. Thomas took it, his brow furrowing. But as his eyes scanned the words, his expression darkened. "That woman. She just won't stop." His voice was low, angry. He slammed the letter on the counter. How did she even send this? Prisoners can't just mail threats like this. Kathy swallowed. She said she's not alone. What if she has help? That was the worst part. Clara might have been locked up, but she still had connections. People who believed in her. People who might be willing to do her dirty work. Thomas clenched his fists. "I'm calling the police." A terrifying discovery. The police arrived within the hour, taking the letter as evidence. "This is definitely concerning," one officer admitted, flipping the page over. "We'll be looking into how she sent it." But what Thomas and Kathy didn't expect was what the police discovered next. 2 days later, an investigator knocked on their door. "You were right to be worried," he said grimly. "Clara isn't just making empty threats. We checked the prison records, and we found out that she's been having secret visitors." Kathy's breath caught. "Who?" The officer hesitated before saying a name that sent chills down both their spines. "Raymond. An old enemy returns." Raymond, the con artist who had betrayed Clara to save himself, had recently been released on parole. And yet, despite everything, he had gone straight to visit Clara in prison. Why? The investigator sighed. "Our guess? He's helping her. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of revenge. But either way, it's not good." Thomas clenched his jaw. "That snake." Kathy hugged herself, suddenly feeling cold. "What do we do?" The officer straightened. "We're putting extra surveillance on your house. If anything suspicious happens, let us know immediately." Thomas nodded. "We will." But even with the police watching over them, Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was coming. And she was right. A mysterious stranger. A week later, as Kathy was leaving school, she noticed something strange. A black car parked across the street. Its tinted windows made it impossible to see inside. She felt someone watching her. Her stomach twisted, and she quickened her pace. Was she just imagining things? She reached the sidewalk and glanced over her shoulder. The car's engine roared to life. And before she could react, it pulled away and sped off. But not before she caught a glimpse of the driver's face. A face she recognized. Her breath caught. Raymond. The fear sets in. Kathy ran home as fast as she could, bursting through the front door. Dad! He's back. Thomas shot up from his seat. Who? What happened? Raymond. I saw him outside my school, watching me. Her father's expression darkened with fury. That's it. We're not waiting for them to come to us. We're going to end this, once and for all. Kathy's heart pounded. What do you mean? Thomas reached for his coat. We're going to find out exactly what they're planning. Before they have a chance to strike. And with that, the battle wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking the fight straight to Clara and Raymond. Because this time, they would be the ones who regretted it. The final showdown. The walls of their home no longer felt safe. Every shadow seemed darker, every noise louder. Thomas and Kathy knew the storm was coming, they just didn't know how or when. But one thing was certain, they were not going to sit back and wait. They were going to end this, once and for all. The plan to strike first. Thomas stood in the dimly lit living room, gripping his phone. He had just gotten off a call with Detective Willis, the officer assigned to their case. The police were watching Clara's movements, but their surveillance wasn't enough. They needed more. I won't let them hurt you, Kathy, Thomas said, turning to his daughter. We have to find out what they're planning before it's too late. Kathy swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the kitchen counter. How? They could be anywhere. Thomas ran a hand over his face. Raymond is the key. If he's working with Clara, he's the one we need to track. Kathy's mind raced. And then, suddenly, an idea hit her. What if we set a trap? Thomas raised an eyebrow. I mean, Raymond and Clara think we're scared, right? What if we act like we don't know what's coming? We could draw them out, catch them before they catch us. Her father exhaled slowly, considering it. It's risky. But it might be our only shot, Kathy insisted. And so, the plan was set. They would lure Raymond in. Baiting the trap. The next morning, Kathy went about her day as normally as possible. She walked to school as usual, ignoring the uneasy feeling in her gut. She even took the long way home, walking past the places she suspected Raymond might be watching from. And sure enough, the black car appeared again. Only this time, Kathy didn't run. She kept her pace steady, pretending not to notice. And then, at the last moment, she turned down a narrow side street, one that led straight to a dead-end alleyway. She waited. The sound of a car door slamming shut echoed behind her. She turned slowly. Raymond stood there, a smirk on his face. You should have kept your mouth shut, kid. Raymond's mistake. Kathy's heart pounded, but she didn't let her fear show. She tilted her head. Funny, I was about to say the same to you. Raymond frowned, and then he heard it. Footsteps. A figure emerging from the shadows. Thomas. And in his hand? A voice recorder. Every word Raymond had just said. Caught on tape. Raymond's smirk faded. You little. Before he could finish, police sirens wailed from down the street. A police car screeched to a stop, officers pouring out. Raymond turned to run, but he was too late. Detective Willis tackled him to the ground. Game over, Thomas said coldly. Raymond struggled, cursing, but the handcuffs clicked into place. His plan had just crumbled. The truth comes out. Later that evening, Thomas and Kathy sat at the police station as Detective Willis went over the case. We searched Raymond's phone, the detective said, setting it down on the table between them. And we found exactly what we needed. Kathy leaned in. What do you mean? Detective Willis tapped the screen, showing a string of messages between Raymond and Clara. Clara, are you watching them? Raymond, yeah. They don't suspect a thing. Clara, good. When I give the signal, you know what to do. Kathy's stomach twisted. She had planned something. Thomas clenched his fists. So, what now? The detective smiled grimly. Raymond's talking. He's trying to cut a deal, and in doing so, he's selling Clara out. Thomas exhaled in relief. Clara won't be seeing freedom anytime soon, Willis continued. Not after we charge her with conspiracy to commit a crime. She was pulling the strings from inside that prison cell, and now we have proof. It was over. Really over. A new beginning. A week later, Kathy sat on the porch, staring up at the sky. It felt surreal, knowing that Clara and Raymond could no longer hurt them. The fear that had haunted them for so long was gone. Thomas stepped outside, placing a hand on Kathy's shoulder. You okay, kiddo? She smiled. Yeah, Dad. I think I am. He pulled her into a hug, and for the first time in a long time, Kathy felt truly safe. Life wasn't perfect. But now, at least, they had the chance to make it better. And that was more than enough.